First off, Reinier de Graaf. And in the format we have, as you know, there's a little film to introduce the speaker, so I can keep it very short. Reinier de Graaf is an architect. He works for an architecture firm called OMA, in which he is a partner with Rem Koolhaas. And in the course of events, they started a sort of a think tank within the architectural firm called AMO. And I just asked Reinier, what does that stand for? And he said, well, it's the reverse of OMA. Right, okay, so that is the name of his research institute. Reinier, may I invite you to the stage? And while you're coming here, we will give you a brief introduction with the interview that you just gave.
My name is Reinier de Graaf. I'm a partner in the Office for Metropolitan Architecture, where I head the work of its think tank, AMO. My idea of the smart city is that I really have no idea. I don't understand the whole discussion. What annoys me in particular is that the people who talk about the smart city imply that everybody who's been dealing with the city up until then was stupid. I think where the digital technology is different from all technologies before is that it might be the first technology that doesn't allow us to do more, it allows us to know more. It doesn't necessarily physically change the objects in our life, it changes our knowledge about them. And in changing our knowledge about them, it changes our relation to them. And therefore I think it will allow different types of use of essentially existing things, whether they're old buildings, old cities, and you also see this happening. I realize this introduction sets me up for a huge amount of trouble. I have a major problem because by my own admission, I'm standing here talking about something that I know nothing about. And the term smart city has been around for quite a while, but in all that time, I don't think I've ever met anybody who has unequivocally been able to be clear as to what it is. And I had really hoped that this conference would shed some light on the matter just before I had to speak. But I have to say I am not really any clearer than I was before. I'm sorry. So what do you do when you don't know? You go on Google. That is the most prolific definition of being smart that I guess is around. So I looked at what is the city. I did some linguistic deconstruction of the invitation. What is the city? Well, the city, that was more or less a familiar set of images, cityscape, skyline. I can sort of make sense of this. I can relate to this. I mean, some of the buildings even here may or may not have been designed by our office, but that's not that it matters. So then I went on smart. What is smart? Smart. Smart is a car. Smart is a smart car. Smart is a smart. And then I went on to the future. And the future is a road sign. It is a road sign to nobody quite knows where. So then I was probably even more confused than I was when I didn't Google. And I wondered, does the smart city have something to do with cars? It must have something to do with computers. So I continued my deep dive, my research, as you may call it. And I ended up, God forbid, at Volkswagen diesel information, the most clear example of what a combination of cars and computers amount to. Namely, a very clever way of beating, or should I say, cheating, the system. So I wondered, what should I do? Should I really be here? Should I cancel? Should I call in sick? And then I thought, no, I will talk about the one word that I do know something about, and that is cities. I would like to talk about cities.
We have designed cities, we've built some cities, we've designed them in great detail. I know them to be incredibly physical, muddy phenomena. And of course, they are a phenomena with an immensely long tradition. This is a city from the Renaissance in the 15th century, Palma Nova in Italy, completely designed by an architect as a totalizing vision of his ideal, mirrored in the image of man. Leonardo da Vinci's Vitruvian Man was slightly before, the measure of all things great and small. And of course the Renaissance was the rediscovery of an even older tradition, that of the Romans. That is a diagram of Vitruvius, this is another diagram of Vitruvius, of the layout of the ideal city. A diagram which meanwhile has had an enormously long history. This is the same diagram at the height of Islamic culture, which actually forms the basis of Baghdad. This is again in the Renaissance, Filaretus Sforcinda in the 15th century. This is the same diagram carried into the 18th century in Karlsruhe. And this is the diagram continued into the earliest 20th century, Ebenezer Howard, the Garden City, as is this. And then half a century later in Sun City, Arizona, this is the physical realization of that diagram. So the city is a thing with 2,000 years of tradition, essentially a very physical thing. Then something in the 21st century happened. No longer a sum total of physical needs and physical means, but in a way a diagram of seemingly esoteric human requirements, which is now called the smart city, where the user is central, surrounded by needs, even if it's not quite clear how these needs will have to be met in reality. But of course, a phenomena with great authority, and of course, thank God, a phenomena with a unique ability. The only unfortunate thing for an architect is that that phenomena is apparently no longer ours. It is yours. I'm generalizing, I'm aware. So basically, from the days of Vitruvius, from before Christ, here it was ours. Now it is no longer ours. In this case, it is oracles. Basically, from a concrete proposition to an abstraction. And where does this lead us? It seems as if today we have really two types of architecture. We have architecture in the physical sense as I know it, and apparently then we have architecture, between quotation marks, which is made by non-architects who call themselves architects and who see it as an excuse to talk about everything. They use our terms. Architect, arena, blueprint, construct, platform, pantheon, framework, theater, stage, etc., etc., etc. But more often than not, these terms are used in a metaphorical sense and no longer their literal sense. And particularly in the realm of the digital, it is almost one-on-one that our glossary, our vocabulary, is now the whole system of apparently organization. So, the city of the future, evidently, no longer belongs to us, smart and connected. It belongs to these people, the 1,000,001 tech companies that are now dealing with the city, the smart city in particular. They write very confidently. They write with great authority about them. We used to produce manifestos as architects about the city. Now they produce manifestos. Let's look at some of those manifestos, three of the largest ones, Siemens, Cisco, and IBM. Let's look at the language they produce. Smart city development is a question of when, not if, a question of how, not what, why, because we live in a world experiencing economic turmoil, climate change, aging population, and rapid urbanization, but we also live amidst immense technological innovation. So an incredible optimism. Here, IBM, no, not really different, climate change, rising energy prices, blah, 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 blah. It will show up on the utility bill. And here's Siemens, urbanization, population growth, climate change, dwindling resources. So combined, these three firms alone address the sum total of all mankind's current problems. And the whole formula of the rhetoric is always the same. And it's a very smart marketing formula. First you predict the apocalypse, and then you offer redemption. In that sense, unwittingly, the smart city also continues a 2,000-year-old tradition, namely that of the Bible. And I will show wonders in the heaven and in the earth, blood and fires and pillars of smoke. The sun shall be turned into dark, and the moon into blood, before the coming and the great awesome day of the Lord. So no offense, but just a kind of historic analogy. What do they do? What are the competencies each of these claims? Smart water, integration, smart public service, smart buildings. This is Cisco. IBM, interesting, healthcare, public safety, social services, education, energy. Siemens, public administration, healthcare, again, security, harbors, finance, energy. And it's very interesting that if you add up these public competences, these used to be public services. These used to be public tasks. These used to be tasks that were administered by people for whom we voted. Currently, they're no longer public. In a way, the smart city, for me, is a continuation and an extrapolation of an elaborate privatization program, where now these competencies are offered by technology firms. Clearly, you can wonder with what kind of motives. And here is a very interesting and extreme example. This is in Rio de Janeiro, the Centro de Operações of the Prefeitura of Rio. It's a control room built by IBM, but it's also more commonly known as Rio's digital town hall. Again, a public entity in private hands. It's modeled on NASA's control room, and the analogy is, of course, taken into the extreme that employees are forced to wear astronaut-like jumpsuits. And what do? I mean, they look at Rio. And then they see Rio, and they see that Rio has favelas. They see that Rio is poor. But my question is, what really changes when you see that on a computer screen? How is this any different? Because, I mean, on the computer screen and with big data, we may know, very impressive numbers exactly to how poor Rio is, but how much closer is the political solution to actually doing something about it? And in that sense, IBM itself is very clear. I have a little film where they, not in Rio, but in America, explain what their digital technology can do, and I simply hope it works.
I used to think my job was all about arrests, chasing bad guys. Now I see my work differently. We analyze crime data, spot patterns, and figure out where to send patrols. It's helped some U.S. cities cut serious crime by up to 30%. By stopping it before it happens. Let's build a smarter planet.
Well, very impressive, but I mean, what maybe nobody knows is this. I think this film was shot in St. Louis, in the St. Louis metropolitan area, with whom IBM has a partnership. And of course, St. Louis metropolitan area is recently known for some very different policing. You probably all remember the killing of Michael Brown, which in a way led to the worst riots and urban violence since the American Civil Rights Movement. Where the police assumed a considerably less discreet role than working from behind a computer screen, but was actually dressed in military outfits, where the only really smart technology were their goggles, the rifles, and other kind of digital electronic warning gear, dressed in the uniform, certainly not a desktop. Let's look at St. Louis. Let's look at the record of St. Louis when it comes to the public service of public safety. Surprise, surprise, is not very good. The public sector, in an effort to, in a way, recoup an eroding tax base, is obsessed with fining poor people, immense fines for relatively minor offences, from wearing saggy pants to noise violations, etc., and charge huge amounts of interest when people can't pay these fines, and they lock people up in illegal debtors' prisons, all in a way to create finances for scrambling public services, which is in a way rather sinister. In the middle of that, of course, IBM, with their Smart City initiative, has risen to the challenge. Very interestingly, the first thing they did was give the city an award, and since they were involved, they gave themselves an award. So pat on the back before the real work has started. But let's be fair, and let's give them a fair chance. It's a private institution that claims that they can improve public safety, a formerly public task. Let's see if they can do it better. St. Louis is a very interesting city for architects. It was the home of the Pruitt-Igoe development, a sort of large Bijlmermeer, which was demolished in 1972 because of excessive crime and social problems. It was a public housing project. And many architecture critics have in a way identified that moment as the death of modern architecture as a whole. So where there was an enormous public housing development, there is currently a green field. Much of the city around it is gone as well. Today there stands empty streets, a kind of forest in the middle of the city where you literally have to point to where that housing development once was. It used to be this, but then it got all demolished. It was done away with. It was dismissed as a large failure. Other critics who do not just see it as the failure of modern architecture, but of modern architecture's entire involvement with the city, of all of modern architecture's ideals, of all of modern architecture's manifesto, to be a credible profession that claims how to deal with the city. This was 1925, the city of the future then. I guess when we demolished Pruitt-Igoe, we also definitively did away with this. All I can say, and we did away with these, all the manifestos of the whole 20th century architectural avant-garde. All I can say is that I simply hope that this time, the city of the future in St. Louis, which is the burying ground of modern architecture and architecture's involvement with urbanism, will do a better job. The question remains out. Thank you very much.
Well, that was a quick end. First of all, let me say I'm glad you didn't call in sick.
Okay.
Thank you. Secondly, I've been scribbling away. So, one of the ways to frame the question is St. Louis demolished their so-called modernism, modern architecture area. Amsterdam still has the Bijlmer.
Well, partially. I mean, it's also partially demolished.
Right.
Partially turned into low-rise.
So, what's your conclusion? Are we done with mass building, or have we done it wrong? Should we do it differently, or?
Well, there's a very beautiful, of course, when you dismiss history and when you say something is over, there's a very beautiful William Faulkner quote who says, "The past isn't dead and buried. In fact, it isn't even past." I'm sure the same will go for my profession. I would hope so. But I just think one of the things I always notice is that there's an enormous amount of almost naive optimism in the technology and the smart city debate. Of course, coming from a profession that is incredibly old, you know what the price of optimism can be, and in that sense I'm sure that there are things around the corner where also the smart city will get a bit more than they bargained for.
Your one bit of advice for people who aspire to build smarter cities?
Oh, maybe read a history book.
Stop right there. Thank you.